Hello and welcome to another installment of History Hack. We've gone proper left field today, haven't we, Alina?
Oh, totally.
But this is good. This could be good.
We're very excited actually because we're going out of the box a little bit with this one. So we've got with us John White Greenlee, who's a medievalist and cartographic historian. His current project is looking at the cultural history of eels in England between the 10th and 17th century. And today we're going to be talking about exactly that, medieval eels.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I always enjoy talking about medieval eels.
This is brilliant. I just have to get one thing out of the way before we start this. Little Miss East London is the greatest place on earth. How many jelly deals have you consumed in your lifetime?
None.
You
It's
fail.
disgusting.
Fail.
Why would any East Londoners want to just know
It's
wrong?
the name as well. It's not exactly like, come eat me.
It's jelly.
It's sort of more a tourist thing at this point, isn't it? In
Yeah.
East London.
It's got to be. We just laugh at them. We'll probably get to them as a food source at some point today. So you're looking between the 10th and 17th centuries, aren't you? So how did you come to the subject of eels?
By accident, really. As you mentioned in your opener, I'm a cartographic historian by training, so I sort of tend to spend most of the time thinking about the ways that people understand the world around them and then reproduce it in maps. And I was looking at maps of London from the 17th century, not looking for eels, but I saw eels. So there were these ships on the Thames labeled eel ships, Dutch eel ships, and they were the only thing that had a label that wasn't a really big civic monument. Like everything else is like the Tower of London or London Bridge or something like that can't like pick up anchor and sail away. And so I wondered why those ships, these eel ships, were on the map and sort of labeled like that. And it seemed like it should be a pretty easy question to get to the bottom of, and then it turned out not to be. And I didn't know anything at all about eels when I started, and now 4 years later, so I know quite a lot about eels. But it took me about that long to sort of reconstruct the sort of history of eels in England up to that point to figure out why they were so important that they showed up on these maps.
So why have you zoomed in on the medieval period?
Well, I am a medievalist also by training. And so this was work that I was doing as part of my my doctoral dissertation. It wound up being my doctoral dissertation. So sort of started looking at medieval eels and then sort of eels in early modern England and London as well. So it's that part at least is sort of in my wheelhouse. The eels were not when I started, but the medieval period is sort of where I tend to look for most things.
It's a bit like you, Alex, really, at the end of the day. You start with your World War One stuff, and then you find this tiny little bit of evidence. You're like, what is this? And it turns into something extremely explosive.
Historian rabbit holes. It's
Those
how
are-
all the best stuff is done.
It really is, you know, those moments where you find a little thread of something in an archive or on a map that doesn't make sense, that stands out because it's different, and you ask why, and then you sort of start pulling on that thread a little bit, and you wind up sort of everything sort of unravels in front of you over time, and then you wind up with hopefully enough thread to, you know, sew something different out of it. If I can really torture that metaphor to death.
Because you put this in your notes, and I'm really interested how this comes about. So how did people pay their rent in the medieval period, and where do eels come into all of this?
Yeah, so this is after sort of I started getting into eels, this is one of the first things that really caught my attention about it. So in medieval England, and especially early medieval England, there's not a lot of hard currency. People don't have a lot of money in their pockets. It just hasn't been printed yet. And so if you're a medieval landlord and you're collecting rent from your peasants, a lot of times, rather than getting it in money because they don't have it, you're taking it in kind. So in grain or honey or eggs or something like that. But one of the biggest sources of in-kind rent was eels. There are just huge numbers of eels being paid in rent in early medieval England. In the end of the 11th century, there's more than 500,000 eels that I have records of, and I know that there's more than that. There's 500,000 eels plus being moved around England every year just in terms of property rent. And that's a lot of fish. And so that really kind of caught my attention. But one of the really interesting things about that is that as over the between the 11th and the 12th centuries, coinage becomes more readily available. They start printing more and more of it. And most in-kind rents disappear over the 12th century, but eel rents hang on for a lot longer. There are still huge numbers of eels being paid in rent up through the Black Death in the mid-14th century, which seems to be when that more or less stops as a really important part of kind of rural economies.
So all of a sudden, all of a sudden that weird little annotation on a map has become a really valuable boat, hasn't it?
Yeah, no, it did, and so the ships on the map are sort of an end product of this long reliance on eels as a sort of food staple that goes back, at least to the Romans probably. Bede talks about eels in multiple places in his ecclesiastical history, and they're sort of all over the place. And so part of what's happening with those ships is you get to London in the early 17th century, and the city's grown so large that it's outstripped its ability to sort of fish eels locally and supply itself, and so they're having to import them from the Dutch. Those are Dutch eel ships, and they've been doing it for a while at that point. But by about 1600, the ships become so important that they sort of become a sort of civic monument, right? Like the Tower of London, and that's getting labeled on these maps. So that's the end product of a really long history that includes these rents.
Eels and religion. How are these two connected?
Well, eels don't go to church much.
Yeah, I was going to say.
So they're a ripe source for conversion. But no, this is one of the reasons why eel rents were popular, I think, and stayed viable longer than other kinds of in-kind rents. So a lot of the really big eel rents, and by big here I mean 50 or 60,000 eels being paid annually to various monasteries. A lot of these were going to monasteries, to big landholding monasteries like Ely or Ramsey or Peterborough. A lot of Finland monasteries, especially, but other ones too, all over the country. And they were almost all due right at the start of Lent, so in the spring sometime. And this had to do with the fact that, so Lent is this period where you're not supposed to eat meat, right? There's 40 days where you're not supposed to eat meat. And the reason you're not supposed to eat meat is because meat reminds you of sex, sort of meat of animals that obviously reproduce sexually. Thomas Aquinas says this reminds you of sex. You're not supposed to think about sex during Lent, so don't eat meat. But fish are okay because fish don't obviously reproduce sexually most of the time, and they have eggs, but eels are even better because the medieval perception of eels was that they reproduced asexually, that there was no sex at all involved in eels, and this has to do with the fact they have this really fascinating life cycle where they're born. All the eels in England are born probably in the Sargasso Sea, out in the middle of the Atlantic, and then they come to England or Europe or wherever they're going. And they grow up, and then they go back to sea to mate and die. But for most of their lives, in sort of on land or sort of in fresh water, they are technically juveniles. They don't have developed reproductive organs. Those don't develop until right before they mate and die. And so, the question about how eels reproduce was something that really bothered people from the classical period onward. Aristotle dissected eels and tried to figure out where they mate, but they mate out at sea where nobody can see them. They don't have reproductive organs. And so he and a bunch of other people sort of came to the conclusion that they must reproduce asexually. Aristotle thought they came out of the mud, sort of sprang out of the mud. Pliny the Elder thought that maybe they rubbed on rocks and like the little flakes of skin that came off grew into bigger eels. But nobody really knew where or how they mated. And so the idea was that they probably reproduced asexually. And that makes them a great food for Lent because it's not just it's a food that has nothing at all to do with sex. And so that makes it perfect. So there's lots of eels in the water in medieval England, a lot of them. And they're a fish that is useful for sort of theological reasons. And so these rents that we do, especially to monasteries, are sort of fulfilling the very particular need that these monks have to go throughout Lent without eating meat. And then there's, by the time you get to the early part of the middle of the medieval period, there's about a third of the year dedicated to these kind of fish days where you're not supposed to eat meat. And so having a rent of eels is really useful because it sort of provides you with a staple of food that you can eat on throughout the year, and stay sort of in bounds as far as your theology goes.
So we've already mentioned eating them. How did people catch and eat eels in the medieval period?
Right. So there's a bunch of ways you can catch them. Excuse me. And that hasn't changed a whole lot, actually. People still catch eels in roughly the same ways they did 1,000 years ago. So you can catch them by line, or you can spear them. Probably the most common way of catching them is in traps. You can sort of, at weirs or dams especially, you sort of funnel the stream down to a point where the eels sort of swim into a trap or a fishing net where they can swim in but have trouble swimming back out. So these sort of passive ways of catching eels are the most effective, because you can catch a lot of them and you just set the trap and walk off. So those are some of the most common ways of catching eels. You can also there's several mentions in sources of stomping after eels, and this is where you're sort of getting a bunch of people and stomping up a river or a creek and driving the eels towards nets. So that's a bit more active. And then there's a bunch of ways you can eat them. So most of the rents that were being paid to monasteries and other landlords were paid in salted and preserved eels. So they're most likely caught in the fall. Eels migrate downstream in the fall. And so those are sort of the biggest and fattest ones. And those are the ones that were due for rent. So you catch them in the fall and you brine them and then smoke them in a cold smoking process that leaves you with meat that's really sort of hard and doesn't taste great, but will last a really long time. And so those are the eels that were being paid in rent in the spring. So you can smoke them like that. But then there's a bunch of other recipes for eels, for fresh eels. Some really basic, sort of cut them into rounds and throw them in a pan. Eel stews and eel pies are really popular. And then there's some really complicated and sort of fancy ways of cooking eel. The most fancy is probably a French recipe called the reversed eel, where you take your eel and fillet it, take the bones out, and then turn it inside out and fill the inside with all kinds of filling, whatever you've got for filling. So sort of breadcrumbs and fruit and other meats and things. And then you tie that back up and cook the whole thing in red wine. So the ways of preparing eels runs a real gamut from really basic to fairly complicated. And all kinds of people ate eels. I've mentioned monks in their monasteries were eating a lot of eels, and they're mostly eating this sort of preserved eels. But common people ate eels, nobles ate eels, kings ate eels. There's a lot of records of royal feasts ordering huge numbers of eels, 10, 20, 30,000 eels at a time for like feasts at Christmas or other points in the year. And so it's a fish that sort of everybody ate in one way or another, kind of throughout the year.
Did you ever see that YouTube video of that man trying to catch eels with Coca-Cola?
Oh, where he's sort of pouring it into the hole, I think?
Yeah.
I have. I don't understand it. I'm not really sure what's going on there, other than I guess eels don't like carbonated drinks, maybe? I don't know.
It's literally, he's pouring this, for people who haven't seen it, go onto YouTube, he's literally pouring Coca-Cola into this like hole in the ground, and out comes this eel, a little bit like, when they used to tame eels with the flute, and it's kind of like coming out of the ground, and then he just grabs it and throws it into a bucket. It's really weird. Just
yeah, there's a couple of videos like that, and it's, I guess, it's a way of fishing eels I'm not really familiar with, and certainly not one that would have been available to medieval people either. But I guess it's the they don't care for the CO2 because it makes it hard for them to breathe, and they pop on out and you grab them. Now, I guess one of the things to draw from that is that eels are what I mostly focus on eels in medieval England and Europe, but eels are a food source for people and have been for a really long time all over the world. There's eels on most continents, not South America, not Antarctica, but the other ones certainly. And anywhere there are eels, there are people eating eels.
I'm not sold on them. Despite all the lovely recipes and stuff, I'm still like, no. So, apart from using them to pay rent and eating them, are there any other ways that eels appear in medieval history apart from food?
There's quite a lot actually, especially in England. The English sort of eat, as I said, a huge number of eels. As the numbers I'm talking about, 500,000 eels is rent. Well, that's just rent. That's the rent you're paying. And a lot of times that's the rent you're paying as a fisherman to fish more eels that you're going to eat or sell for other reasons. So they're eating just a huge number of eels. And one of the consequences of this is that eels show up in a lot of sort of other avenues of cultural production, right? They show up in art and in literature and in language and metaphor and toponyms and family names and all kinds of places. Especially in England, there's a real connection, I think, between identity as an English person, right, and eels. There's a lot of instances where people are using eels as a metaphorical stand-in for sort of a personal metaphorical stand-in, or one for sort of for English people more broadly, or England more broadly. There's guy named Thomas Bradwardine, who was briefly the Archbishop of Canterbury, but died in the Black Death. So in 1348, a little before he died, he wrote a very short book on how to train your mind, on memory practices. And medieval memory is all about mnemonics. It's about assigning mental pictures to words so that you can sort of imagine the picture to remember the word. And so he writes this book about memory practice, and he gives you, towards the end of it, he sort of gives you a big example sentence to help you sort of practice the tools he's given you. And he walks you through the sentence. And the sentence is about the English king attacking the Scottish city of Berwick. And he walks you through the sentence one word at a time. And for each word, he gives you a list of possible mnemonics that you might use to help you remember the word. And usually he gives you 4 or 5 because mnemonic practice is a personal practice and has to do with what's in your head. So he's trying to give you things that you can use personally. So for like king, the word king, he says, all right, so if you know a king like I do, like because he's the Archbishop of Canterbury. If you know a king like I do, then you can think about that guy. If you know somebody whose name is king, that would work. Somebody who acts like a king or dressed like a king at Halloween or something like that. So he gives you a bunch of different examples. But when he gets to England, he says, to remember England, think about an eel. You think about the king holding an eel, and it's the only one it gives you. And he doesn't think you need anything else. That you should be able to make this connection between England and eel, and that's all you need. And that's probably one of the last examples of this. It's a very sort of medieval, this sort of connection between eels and identity is a more medieval issue than an early modern one. But I really like that one because it's very explicit about the fact. It's like, it's the only thing you need. England equals eels. But they're in art. There's eels in the Bayeux Tapestry, and they show up on church walls a lot, on parish churches. A lot of medieval parish churches in the 13th century onward have images of St. Christopher on one of the walls. And in many, many cases in England especially, these get drawn with eels in the water, and in a handful of instances, St. Christopher, rather than holding a staff, which he normally does, is holding an eel spear. And this is something that's very unique to England. There are this sort of idea of Christopher as an eel fisherman doesn't show up on the continent. It's just an English issue. So the eels appear in a whole bunch of places. Like I said, they're eating a ton of them, and so that sort of spills over into a lot of other avenues of thought and identity and cultural production.
We've touched on this already, but can you tell us a bit more about it? Because eels, as you mentioned before, they were used in trade, weren't they?
Yeah, there's quite a lively trade in eels, really. And it's a little bit hard to get a sense of the sort of the outlines of it, because there are there are these eel rents, and that's pretty easy to get a hold of. But it's a little bit harder to see where eels are being traded. But there are, most of the major cities in England have sort of taxes, import taxes, lists of import taxes. You can see where they're charging for eels for tariffs and other sort of import taxes. So there are eels moving around the country other than in rent. One of the places where this shows up actually is in places where it goes wrong, where a business transaction doesn't work out the way it should, and people sue each other. So there are a number of instances of people, having contracted to buy 8 or 10,000 eels from a merchant somewhere, and then it doesn't work out, and so they sue to get their money back. So there are eels moving about the country quite a lot. And then as London starts to grow, especially sort of after sort of starts to recover from the Black Death in 1348, a lot of that trade begins to center more and more on London. As people move to London, they're used to eating eels out in the country where they're coming from, and they move to London and they want to keep eating eels. But as the city grows, like I said, it grows past its ability to support itself from the Thames and the Fleet and other local rivers, and so has to start importing eels. Some of these are coming from the countryside, in wagons from the fens and places like that. But these are mostly dead eels, not live ones. And starting in the mid 15th century, the Dutch, who had been importing dead and preserved eels in barrels, starting in the mid 15th century, they start importing live eels in these ships. So the ships that I saw on those maps on the Thames in the 17th century, those are basically big floating aquariums, right? The holds of the ships are watertight containers, and they're filled with eels. And then they have sort of holes in the side, very small holes in the side of the ships that let water flow in and out, so you get a change of water. And so they're starting in maybe the 1470s or so, the Dutch began to bring over these shipfuls of live eels that they then park in the middle of the Thames, and they're selling. So if you want live eels in London, most of the time you're going to head out to one of these ships, and they'll fish out, however many pounds of eels you're looking for, and then you buy them and you go back home. So it as London begins to expand and grow, it becomes a bigger, and this sort of import from the continent becomes more and more important. And again, this sort of, I think, gets you to the point where in 1600 these ships begin showing up on maps, and not just on maps of London. They also began to show up in plays and in some other places. So they're sort of by that point clearly become a real cultural landmark. Those ships stay there until the 1666, I think. Yeah, 1666, at which point during one of the Anglo-Dutch wars, they get kicked off the Thames, and they get invited back about 15 years later. And then from that point on, those Dutch eel ships stay there in London selling live eels in these boats until 1938. The last one leaves right before World War II. So it's this really long, fascinating history of trade in eels, and especially trade with the continent from the Dutch. That, like you said earlier, sort of pulling at this one question about what are these? I don't understand what these eel ships are doing on these maps. Sort of led to. So it's a really fun rabbit hole of history, as you said earlier.
So what about the modern period? How are they viewed now? Because I've just mocked Alina for not eating jellied eels as an East Londoner, but I honestly don't think outside of East London people are that keen.
Yeah, And that's the case here in the United States as well. We don't really eat eels. It's not part of our sort of popular culture. Um, uh, we don't eat nearly as many of them. They're not as big a part of the diet, not as big a part of the culture. And I think for a lot of people, eels are kind of weirdly repulsive. They're a bit like snakes, and they're slimy, and they're kind of gross.
I tell you what it
Um,
is for me. They're the two little bad henchmen in Little Mermaid. That was my childhood.
yeah, yeah, and that's like I talked about how in the medieval period eels show up in sort of all kinds of avenues of cultural production, and they're usually pretty positive. And at this point, they're not, right? You get the eels in the Little Mermaid, or the shrieking eels in the Princess Bride. Um, when eels show up in movies or books at this point, usually it's they're either evil, like Flotsam and Jetsam and the Princess Bride, or they're repulsive, intentionally repulsive, like the eels in The Tin Drum, which is a movie that turns a lot of people off the eels, the scene where they're sort of fishing with a dead horse head. Uh, and I think this is one of the things that I found in my research is that this has led historians to think about eels in earlier periods only through a negative lens. That when we see references to eels in literature or art or things, the impulse is to look for how that is negative, and so to sort of to read the past through a modern lens. And so a really nice example of this is John Moore, who was Thomas More's father, had this fairly famous quote. And you'll see it on the internet sometimes too. He's talking about the fact that picking a wife is a really it's a bit of a gamble, and he says that picking a wife is a bit like reaching your hand into a bag full of snakes and eels, at a ratio of like 7 snakes to 1 eel. So a lot of snakes, very few eels, and then hoping you pull the eel out. And this has traditionally been, which I think nobody really wants to do that either way, but this has traditionally been read as just an entirely negative comment, right? That like, that it's a dangerous proposition choosing a wife because you might get bitten by, like, you might pick a serpent and that's bad. But like, even if you don't, you just wind up with an eel and that's bad too. And that's been the traditional reading of this quote of his. But I think it's entirely possible to read that a very different way. So Moore is coming out of a culture that really values eels, that eat a lot of eels and have them as sort of a part of their daily lives in a lot of senses, and uses them metaphorically in all kinds of positive and negative ways. So it's entirely possible that people in Moore's day would look at that and say, oh, well, like there's real value in pulling an eel out of a bag. You get an eel and that's great. And so that's one of the issues that sort of our modern distancing from eels has caused us to, I think, misread how they were viewed and thought of and used in the past. And it has other effects as well. So eels are a critically endangered species at this point. They are under threat from climate change and from habitat change, and pollution and all kinds of things. And they are currently the most smuggled animal on Earth in terms of both monetary value and sheer numbers. So there's a black market trade of baby eels when they come into. I mentioned earlier that they're born in the Sargasso Sea and they come to land, and when they get to land, they're what are called glass eels. So they're maybe sort of as long as your hand maybe, and translucent. They're really cool. You can see all the way through them, so you can see their bones and their blood and everything. But there's it's a between the estimated $3 and $5 billion a year trade in these glass eels to China, where eels are a really popular dish in China and Japan and other Asian countries. And so people catch these eels in huge numbers and then smuggle them, usually in bags and suitcases. to China, and then they're grown in ponds there, and then sold in Japan and butchered there, and then it's often shipped around the world. It is sometimes the case that if you buy an eel, like if you buy unagi in the United States, that it's an eel that was caught maybe in Spain and then shipped to China and grown there, and then shipped to Japan and butchered there, and then shipped to wherever you're eating it. So eels are under threat from a whole bunch of directions, and it's often very difficult for scientists to get people interested in saving eels because our sort of cultural understanding of them is that they are gross and weird, and we think about the eels from The Little Mermaid, and so that's a real problem. Eel numbers have declined by about 90% in the last 50 years. It's just been an enormous drop off, and it's hard to get people interested in that. So, I do a lot of work on Twitter and other places trying to make eel history sort of interesting. There's a lot of really weird bits about it, and because we don't have much to do with eels generally, a lot of sort of the ways that medieval people interacted with eels seem odd to us. And so I try to sort of highlight these and make them funny and get people interested in thinking about sort of humans' intertwined history with eels. And you get people thinking about the fact that they have a history with this fish that goes back a really long way. And that, I think, goes a ways towards making the fish making them sort of care more about the fish and think more about it as, well, maybe if it's been part of our past, we want to have it sort of continue on as part of our future. So I think there's real value for historians, I think, in being able to take the work that we do, even really from very far ago, and say, okay, well, this is why it matters now. This is why you should be thinking about eels, not just because it's a sort of these sort of odd tangents of history, but because there are places where this connects to the modern world. These eel ships were on the Thames until 1938. Our past with the fish is not as far gone as you might think it is. And it matters for how we live in the world in the present moment.
John, thank you so much for joining us. That was so interesting. I found that absolutely fascinating, talking about medieval eels, and especially what's happening with them today. I mean, like you said, I find them a little bit gross and slimy and weird, but to be honest, no, you've kind of changed me a little bit. I feel really sad for these poor little eels.
That's a good first step, I think. They're a really fascinating animal. They're a really important part of the sort of natural ecology, and I hope that we can all sort of continue moving forward with eels in the world with us. So I've really enjoyed being here today. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Join us tomorrow because we will have a special edition with Sam Pilling talking about recreating the moon landings. He's an award-winning director and he's got a really interesting story to tell, and Matt Bone managed to talk him onto History Hack, so don't miss out on that one. Join us on Monday when Christian Jennings will be with us to talk all about his new book, which looks at SS massacres in Italy, and one in particular, and the hunt for justice and how justice was never served. So don't miss out on that one. It's a really tragic tale, and we get quite angry discussing whether or not anyone paid for their crimes. Don't forget that we do exist on Patreon as History Hack, and on Patreon as well, which is Podbean's own version. Alina and I have had massive fun doing this in 2020, but life's going to change quite a lot next year, and we're going to actually have to go and earn a living, etc. If we want to keep up the regularity that we've been bringing you and the kind of guests that we've been bringing you and the workload, then we will need your help. So if you join, there's going to be incentives for joining on either of those platforms. We're revamping ourselves on both of them, so don't forget to go in. You can do as little as $1 a month, and it all goes towards keeping up History Hack as regular as we've been able to bring it to you this year. We are now on YouTube. We are posting all of our new episodes on there, and we have our own channel, and we are gradually posting all of the back episodes because we have been made aware of the fact that you can only find the last 100 on some platforms. So you can go and listen to your heart's content and laugh at the cartoons and have a great time. So do go over there and subscribe.